Crab Champions has been out for exactly a year. Well, maybe not exactly. April 1st, 2023. Hopefully this is posted on like the 2nd. Did I hit it? Editor? Did we hit it? No? All right. Anyway, the game's been in early access for a year, and I did a tier list pretty much coming off of the closed beta period. As early access dropped, the full public was able to play it, not just the 2,000 or so closed beta participants, and I give my thoughts and opinions on the weapons. But honestly, a lot of that information is pretty dated. A lot has changed, not just the addition of new enemies and new weapons, but the perks, the loot pool, the enhancement system that just came out, tons of different balances and changes and tweaks and yada, yada, yada. The game is fundamentally in a different spot now, right? So it's about time we reassess the weapon rankings, the weapon tier list. We need to make it abundantly clear going into this, the playing field that we're looking at, the perspective that I'm going into this from, right? So we're not talking about co-op. We're not talking about the best support weapons. We are thinking about this from the perspective of a solo player, nightmare difficulty. Doesn't have to be Namo or diamond runs, right? Doesn't have to be Ultra Chaos, but nightmare, decently hard. And you're not going super far, but you're not just going one loop. Go 2 loops, maybe 3. Island 64, maybe Island 96. So what I have here is a nice spreadsheet. I know, I'm a nerd. Just by looking at this, there's a lot. So I've got all the weapons, number of projectiles when you pull the trigger, number of weapons, some are dual wield, some are not. The fire rate, number of weapons times the fire rate equals the actual projectiles per second, plus we've got our base damage. So we've got our projectiles per second times our base to get an actual base damage per second. Obviously the fire rates are constantly being tweaked, but right now these values should be accurate for the fire rates. And of course, then you have stuff like, Flamethrower has Fire Shot, Arcane Wand has Arcane Shot. So things like that are hard to factor in, especially like Pierce for the Blade Launcher, that's hard to factor in. And then you can give that a rating all the way from very low to very high and a numeric rating there. And then we've got our proc rate. Just in general, weapon mods are very important in this game. It's often the best build strategy, and there's a general consistency with the proc rate of Fire Shot or Ultra Shot or Thorn Shot, right? Weapons like the good old Minigun and the laser cannons, they're higher fire rate but lower proc rate. But even with that, you have to factor in the amount of projectiles and all these things to get an effective proc rate score. High, medium, low, etc. All the way over here. Proc multipliers, all these things. And now we have a damage score and a proc score, and we can add those up into a final score and look at it from that way. So I am doing this very mathematically, but then as you'll see, we do have some opinions as well, and that will ultimately adjust some ratings here or there. I'll just go in the order down here. Someone else created this. Beautiful little screenshots. All the weapons are in. So let's just get into it. So the Arcane Wand coming in pretty weak opening damage per second, and that's ultimately due to a very slow fire rate. That being said, you get Arcane Shot, level 1. And we know, as a community, I hope you're aware, that Arcane is probably the second best out of 5 elements, Poison being the highest. Arcane is a damage over time where it deals 100% of the stacks, waits a second, stacks decrease by 15%, and then it deals that damage again. Very similar to Fire with damage over time, but ultimately it ends up scaling better in the long run and just really chunking enemies, especially elites and bosses. So we've got a relatively low damage per second rating. On a scale of 1 to 5, that's about 2 out of 5. It's meh. And I already said the fire rate's pretty meh too. It's a low and a low. Mathematically, that's around C tier, but we do have Arcane, and you just can't gloss past the fact that you have guaranteed Arcane Shot, level 1, and it's a lowish proc rate, but it's not the lowest by any means. You're gonna deal Arcane stacks, and that's gonna come into play. So yeah, mathematically it's C, but I'm bumping it up to B because of the innate Arcane. I think that's pretty fair. It's a good weapon. Moving on to the auto rifle. This has always been the jack of all trades weapon. It is very, very middle of the road. That doesn't mean it's bad, because we also need to think about this entire tier list from the perspective of build variety, right? Because there are a lot of weapons on here that have potentially some of the best builds in the game if you get the right items. But it's RNG, baby. You're not always going to get those items. And if it's a weapon that requires you to get a very specific build in order to be viable, then ultimately it's not that good of a weapon. So, Assault Rifle has insane variety, S tier variety, but similar to Arcane Wand, damage is okay. You got 5 damage per bullet. Decent fire rate, you know, but ultimately a medium damage rating. And then you look at the proc rate, and it's overall pretty medium. Mathematically, this is also a B tier, and I'm going to agree. Probably better than Arcane Wand, but it's not good enough to stretch up into the A tier, unfortunately. So, yeah, auto rifle, jack of all trades. I said it in my build guide. I'll continue to say it. The fire rate did get a buff recently, and that helps. I probably would have put it towards the bottom of B tier or even top of C tier, but it's probably towards the top of B tier at this point. All right, moving on to the auto shotty. This is an interesting one. I've always loved this, but I don't necessarily run it a lot. But auto shotty actually has a really high base damage per second right now. It keeps getting buffed, and it's to the point where it's like 3rd highest damage per second in the game. It's very high. Couple that with the fact that, yeah, the proc rate per projectile isn't that great, but you're shooting shotgun blasts of 6. And a decently high fire rate too, which means that overall, it is one of the highest proc chances, per second of any weapon here. So you've got high damage and very high proc rate per second. That's S tier. Mathematically, it's S tier. And yeah, again, I don't run this one a lot, but if you go onto like speedrunning.com or whatever the website is for the speedruns, and if you look at a lot of the recent ones, especially on this current build with the enhancements, all categories, whether it's easy, any percent, or nightmare, just the first loop or whatever, so many auto freaking shotty runs. So many. And that's because it's one of the best weapons in the game right now. Is it the very best? We'll find out. Let's move on here. Blade Launcher. This is a fun one. Blade Launcher has always been good. I used to put it S unanimously by default. I would say it's one of the best weapons in the game when we had, 8 or 10 or 12 weapons. But things have changed, and damage has overall gone down over time. Damage per second is sitting more of the middle of the pack, and the proc rate is relatively low, but it has that pierce. Each projectile hits 3 times, so that can effectively triple some things, right? And that's where it becomes a little bit of a mixed bag. But ultimately, I still think it's very good. So mathematically, it's probably more of a B, but because of the pierce and because it's just such a staple of this game, and I promise running it never feels bad. So I'm going to bump it up to A. It's probably towards the bottom of A, maybe the middle of A, but I think just the pierce coming into play, it really sets it apart. Pierce is underrated. When you can do damage to more than one enemy at a time, it just completely changes the dynamic. Burst pistol. Fun one. I don't personally like running it that much. I think if I'm going to go for a high fire rate, I personally enjoy some other weapons more. But math is math, baby. It's got a pretty medium damage per second, and it's got a pretty medium proc rate per second. So ultimately, that's pretty medium in the B tier. Some people could argue A. Some people probably argue C. I think it's very middle of the road. I don't have too much to say about this weapon, and especially with some other weapons coming out, like the Marksman Rifle that shoot additional projectiles. It's not a burst, but it is a built-in triple shot, basically. Yeah, I just don't find myself going for burst pistol very often. I had fun in the piercing wave build with the burst pistol, but even that probably would have been more fun with the minigun. Nothing really too special about it. I would still prefer auto rifle or arcane over it. Now we're moving on to the cluster launcher. I like this weapon a lot. I think it's a fun one. Another one where I don't end up running it that often, but the stats are pretty decent. Medium damage per second, about 72. Burst pistol is actually a little higher at 75, but the kicker with the cluster is a relatively high proc rate. Ultimately, that's A tier, and unfortunately, there's a lot that I have slotted for A tier. Too many, and I ultimately had to be like, look, what's the weakest A tier? We're dropping it down to B, and a cluster is more or less that. I have it as the strongest B tier weapon ahead of the AR. I guess ultimately we can't have everything be good. It's all relative, and I said at the beginning, there are weapons that have insanely god tier builds. But we're looking for variety here. Cluster's pretty solid. It does have good variety, but not A-tier variety. I think the last thing I'll say about the cluster is that ultimately it does end up being a better support weapon where you spray large areas, take out crowds, but when it comes to single target, unless you're rocking grip tape, it is a little tough to land all your shots on a single enemy. Anyway, it's definitely good. Let's move on to the crossbow. The crossbow, you guys, I don't need to drag this one on. It's S-tier. In fact, it's the best weapon in the game for normal circumstances. We're not talking about maxed out runs where You know, everything comes down to your base damage per projectile, stuff like that, because then obviously sniper wins and has the highest damage per single projectile. I'm talking about, you know, maxed out, like you broke the fire limit, like you are shooting the maximum amount of projectiles per second at like 500, right? So ultimately it would come down to how fast you can scale the damage, and you know, you scale from the base. So the highest base would win in that scenario. So yes, a maxed out build, sniper, done. No conversation. But we're talking about real freaking scenarios, okay? Real games, real runs, and the crossbow is the best. It has a pretty medium damage per second, the 7-shot spread, built-in arc shot, basically. He might as well just give it to you. You just can't beat it when it comes to anything that procs, which is majority of all builds. It doesn't start at a low damage. You know, it's middle of the pack, but I don't know. I'm telling you, go into any game with a crossbow and try to lose. It's actually hard. We are putting this one in S tier, number 1. The Crossy, been that way since, well, he went through a bunch of revisions actually, but once he made it more or less the permanent arc shot, everyone came together and said, yeah, this is probably the best weapon, and it has stayed that way for a while. I don't remember the exact date on that, but most of the year, if not the whole year, I think so. I think since this game hit the public, it's been arc shot. I don't know, someone correct me in the comments. Let's move on here. Dual pistols. Yet another middle of the road damage, a little bit lower at 60 DPS, but you are dueled, so it's really 30 per shot, and you do lose that ADS, which in my opinion really makes it worse. I promise you, if you're watching this and you're like, how do some of these people get diamond or get like the flawless normal run, like all the harder difficulties and the harder challenges, you're probably not utilizing your ADS slow-mo. Enemies struggle to hit you when you're doing that, especially if you're moving around quick and then you're like kind of hovering and slowly. It just throws off their aim. I promise you, get used to doing that. And you can't do that with the dual wield weapons. It screws you over. I could vent about this for 20 minutes. I'm gonna be honest. I hate the dual pistols. Anyway, moving on. Low damage per second. Medium. Feels low. It's medium technically. And here's the kicker. Really mid-medium proc rating as well. So mathematically, this should be a B. But again, you lose that aim. You lose the ADS. And I cannot let that slide, baby. We're throwing it down to C. A demotion. Look, I'm gonna be honest. Nothing's F tier. There's enough build variety for all these weapons to be okay. Be middle of the road, be C or B, right? But I'm just gonna let you in on a secret. Dual pistols is the worst weapon in the game, in my opinion. I don't care if the math says it should be up here somewhere. I'm going to be inconsistent with if the math justifies it one way or another. But man, I hate the dual pistols. All my homies hate the dual pistols. +1 in the chat if you hate the dual pistols. Look, I'm going to be real. There is zero incentive to use the dual pistols over any of the other weapons in this game. There are some other similar ones, right? The burst, even like the Marksman Rifle that we're going to get to soon, or the AR. But I will never voluntarily pick the dual pistols over these similar weapons. I'm literally never going to run them except for achievements and challenges and whatnot. I swear to God, it's the worst weapon in the game. You can fight me in the comments if you want, but I will not listen. Now let's move on to the dual shotguns. Now this is one where the dual wielding actually benefits the weapon because it's the shotgun, the sawed-off basically. You're up in everyone's face to begin with. You don't really need to aim. You are sliding around, ducking, duck, dive, dip, dodge, duck, dive, dip. Anyway, I like the dual shotties. Lack of aim doesn't actually ruin it for me. And it actually has one of the higher DPSs in the game at about 86.4. It's a weird number there because your fire rate's 1.2. You've also got 6 projectiles per shot, but 2 of them, so it's 12 times 1.2. Anyway, high damage per second up in everyone's face. And just like the auto shotgun, it has a decent proc rate. But because you're shooting that giant cluster, it ends up being high. It's not as high as the auto shotty overall, but it's still high. So we have a high damage and a high proc rate. That's A tier, baby, and I agree. It's good. Is it above the blade, though? Well, that is kind of up for you to determine. I would say no. I think the blade is better, but the dual shotties are up there. They're up there, and they've been in the game since day one. Well, it wasn't dual wield from day one, but you get the point. It's been a weapon forever. Actually, no. I keep forgetting. If you're a normal person who's playing this game, you only got access for early access a year ago. I think it was dual wield at that point. But there was literal day one where the pistol wasn't dual wield. It was a single. It was like a pea shooter. It was awful. Shotgun was not dual wield. It was a single. And it was a lot worse. So many changes. Anyway, yeah, dual shotties are good. Have fun with them. The build variety is probably not as good as it could be, but you still have a lot of options, even, when you have to stick to that close to medium range. Flamethrower. Ooh, I should love this one. Furnace. We got the lava lamp. Fire. Wow. Here's the thing, though. Fire damage over time element in this game is arguably the worst. Maybe it's better than ice. So it's 4th out of 5. Whatever. It's meh. You should take poison. You should take arcane. You should even take lightning. Lightning got a big buff semi-recently, So the fire is not that great, but it is built in. You can always count on some fire stacks. But the rest of it's the single lowest damage per second if you don't factor in the fire. It's only 1 damage per projectile. It doesn't shoot that fast. There's a medium proc rate, and then you do have to factor in the fire. So this is where math says it's C tier, but you do have the fire, and I think that pulls it up to very low B tier, way over here. It has its purpose. It's really cool that he introduced the elemental weapons, Flamethrower and Arcane Wand, with the built-in Arcane Shot and Fire Shot. I do think it has its place. And, I mean, you put Aura Shot on Flame, it might be stronger than Aura on any other weapon. But, ultimately, that starting point of 1 damage without the fire is so freaking low. The fire rate's not that great. The range is abysmal. You're locked into close to medium range. It's just a tough sell. I could see it being argued and pushed down to C, but for now, we're going to leave it as super low B tier. And we're going to move on to the laser cannons. Laser cannons are a really fun one, in my opinion, but the math is not in their favor. It is an extremely low damage per second. 1 damage per projectile, 15 fire rate, which is the fastest default fire rate, faster than Minigun starting off, but remember, Minigun has escalating shot, and it ramps all the way up a lot higher. If Minigun didn't have it, then I think laser cannons were faster. Especially it's dual wield, so it's 50 per second times 2, really. And the proc rate it ends up being high-ish due to the fast fire rate, but the individual percent is always single digits. It's 4%, 3%, 5%, depending on the weapon mod. It's always really low. So we've got very low damage. We've got medium to high proc rate. That's a B. But this is where the gut feelings come in. I'm putting it A. I'm putting it A because of how incredibly fast the fire rate is. Kind of requires sharp shot, or at least a couple levels of damage shot, but you're gonna find those eventually. And if you don't find sharp shot and you get screwed over by chaotic and spiraling shot, these projectiles are so fast that you don't really see the chaos. You don't see the spiral. You don't see the snake. What's the last one? Zigzag. You don't really see those, at least not until like level 3 or 4. So you can stack those entry-level mods, and it still makes a big difference. And then you can carry on with finding 1 or 2 levels of bubble shot, and all of a sudden, the bubbles are proccing like crazy. Then you get into the enhancements, and the enhancements have single-handedly made all of those perks way stronger. Yeah, there's RNG, but regardless, that's a whole nother video getting into the enhancements if you guys want to see that. But I honestly think, ultimately, the fire rate is so crucial for a normal run. We're not talking about a maxed out run where every weapon can max out the fire rate. We're talking about a normal run where, yeah, you can focus on getting rapid fire supercharged, or you could just pick laser cannons and ignore those, or maybe only get 1 or 2 levels of them because you don't need it. It's not like the sniper or the rocket, which we'll get to, which are so damn slow that you need to find fire rate. So, because of all that, I'm pushing laser cannons up to A tier. All right, moving on to the brand new weapon, relatively, the Marksman Rifle. Oh, baby. This is a fun one. This is a fun one because guess what? Pretty solid damage per second. We've got 8 damage per projectile, 3 projectile burst, so it's 24 if you hit all 3, and you will. It's a tight spread. You got the sniper scope built in, and then you got decent fire rate. It's kind of like a perfect in-between the AR and the sniper. It's a great weapon, and it's got a pretty high proc chance. Like, higher than it should be. Like, honestly, by the time this video hits, Noidstorm might tweak it. Actually, I don't know. I feel like there's no update coming for a few months. We'll just take the benefit. So it's got medium damage, high proc rate. That equals A tier in my opinion. And yeah, I think that's fair. In fact, I think it's like right here. I'm gonna put it in front of dual shotty. Look, keeping distance in this game is hard to do. There's just so many enemies, and they spawn everywhere. They get up in your face. But there's always a little annoying ant or pumpkin or laser skull or minigun crab sitting behind a rock really far away, just being annoying. And being able to scope in on them and accurately take them out with a genuinely decent weapon already has good fire rate, already has decent damage. It's just really good. I mean, yeah, the diamond run that I did with Marksman Rifle was like my first attempt. It was just like straight up the easiest diamond run I've ever had. Now, some of that's enhancements, obviously, and I got bubble enhancement that was like splitting. It's just insanity. I mean, enhancements on bubble shot alone is like one of the best build strats at this point. Bubble shot's just crazy. But all that being said, regardless, I've played with Marksman Rifle since then just to get more clips and stuff. And it's like, it just rips through islands. It's very, very good. Let's move on to the minigun. The minigun is very similar to the laser cannon. Two main differences. You get your ADS, which I've already beaten to death, that I think is very valuable. But on the flip side, you get escalating shot. And escalating shot has ultimately made this weapon worse. And the reason I say worse is because it kind of forces you into one of two general build strategies, which, that's not super variable. That's not as open. You kind of have to pick a path and stick to it and just let it happen and lean into it, or else you're going to have a hard time. So those paths, in my opinion, are embrace the spread, because escalating shot starts off slow, it gets really fast, but as the fire rate gets faster, like the spread and the recoil gets higher. So you end up spraying and praying. So you either embrace that, try to find arc shot, get blind fire, a recoil shot, just like turn into a close range spray and pray minigun, or you try to negate it by finding grip tape. And if you don't find grip tape, you're screwed. You can't negate it. Maybe you can slow your fire rate down with like heavy hitter. Either way, it's like a pain in the ass. But once you do find grip tape level 1 or 2, it does kind of turn into a laser beam, and then at that point you can really melt those single targets like they're a little farther away, the elites, the bosses. But just the fact that you kind of have to pick one of those and lean into it really brings it down in my book. I still love running minigun. I'm still going to continue doing it for the fun builds where I'm stacking one, epic weapon mod to the moon, but I'm acknowledging that it's not as good as it used to be. So we got a low damage per second rating and a medium proc rating. Again, medium due to the high fire rate, not the chance. The chance is super low, just like laser cannons, 3, 4, 5%. All that being said, it's about B tier. It's kind of towards the bottom of B tier. It's not as bad as Flamethrower. Flamethrower, I've said, is very low. I've got it right here, in the middle of B tier, ahead of Arcane Wand and Burst Pistol and Flamethrower, but behind AR and Cluster Launcher. So, look, there was a time where minigun and laser cannons were like, oh, do you want the dual wield version or the version that can aim down sights? Relatively fair trade-off. Now, you got to deal with escalating shot. And again, escalating shot forces you into one of two build strategies, and I think that takes away from the variety, and that bumps it down from around A tier down to B tier. Let's move on to the Orb Launcher. This is a fun one because I've generally preferred these two, right? Laser and minigun. I love them. Even auto rifle, just due to the variety. But Orb, believe it or not right now, has the single highest base damage per second. And that is due to a 15 fire rate, the same as laser cannons. It's higher than auto rifle. But the kicker is that the projectiles do 8 damage. It's 120 damage per second. That's very, very high. Single highest, again. So, very high DPS. What about the proc rate? Well, it's actually not bad at all. Effectively, it's also pretty high. Not very high, but it's amongst the higher ones. So we got a very high and a high rating. Guess what? That's S tier. That's S tier, baby. That is our third and final S tier weapon. Some people hate the Orb Launcher. Some people might actually argue it's more like B, but I'm gonna let the math speak for itself on this one. And regardless of if I would prefer to run laser cannon, at the end of the day, starting at 8 with a similar fire rate is just really freaking good. It just is. You don't really need to get higher fire rate. So you can focus on maybe finding triple shot or arc shot or split shot, one of those, and then find thorn shot or bubble shot or one of those, and you're good. There's just a good variety there. So let's move on to the rocket launcher. Rocket launcher is, I was defending it in the Discord for a little bit. I was defending it just in my mind, and I can't defend it anymore. Noisestorm has nerfed this into the ground. It is just not a good viable weapon right now due to how low the damage is. Yes, you can fire into a crowd of basic crab enemies and nuke them all, but when it comes down to fighting off 3 elite fire crabs, you're gonna struggle. The projectiles move slow, they don't hit that hard, and unless you jack your fire rate way up and find splitting plus arc plus triple plus square shot, all of those, it's just not enough damage output. You're just not getting it done. So 26.3 damage per second. That's because a base of 35, but it's not even 1 fire rate per second. It's 0.8. so it's actually less technically. It is the second lowest DPS in the game. The only thing lower, good old Flamethrower. But even Flamethrower has Fire Shot that can rack up fire stacks and make up for it, right? Rocket doesn't have that advantage. It has splash damage. But again, you don't die to a group of crabs typically. You're dying to some stronger champion enemies or the elites. And it's raw goals unless you find the exact build. Like, you need fire rate and you need arc shot or split shot or triple shot or a combination of those, and that's just too limiting. So mathematically, it's C. It's not bad enough to put F. So it's down here in C tier. Moving on to the Seagle. Seagle's another new one. I like it a lot. It's very strong, very high damage per second. In fact, 100. 25 per bullet. 4 projectiles per second. That's 100. That's the second highest in the game. Second to Orb Launcher. Where it does fall off a bit is more of a medium proc chance. You know, it just doesn't have the largest magazine in the game. The fire rate could be better. 4 is not bad, right? But it's not the AR with 12 and a half. So ultimately, math throws that bad boy in A tier. I think that's pretty fair. I do like it more than certain weapons, but it's not enough to go up to S tier. Initially, I was like, oh, this might be another S. Like the first couple runs with it. But I've also had some runs where it really fell behind. And yeah, I think A is pretty fair. I do have it pretty high up in A, probably right here. Yeah, like the 5th best maybe. So yeah, I mean, it's definitely good. I know I'm not like I'm not hyping it up too much, but maybe it's just like, I know it's good, but it's not super exciting for me personally in my playstyle. So maybe that's where I'm coming from. I mean, the Seagull noise is hilarious. It's a deagle. You know, it has its place. I think it filled a nice gap, and especially with the Marksman Rifle now, you know, the gap between something like the AR and the sniper is well filled with both the Seagle and the Marksman Rifle, so I like it. Anyway, there it is, A tier. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. And our last, but certainly not least, the Sniper. Sniper's an interesting one. This is another one, kind of like Blade Launcher, where, I mean, I have multiple short form videos that you may have seen, may not, where I'm like, oh, Sniper's the best weapon in the game. And it used to be like, Sniper, Minigun, Blade, boom, S tier, all of these. Not so much anymore. They've just kind of gotten worse compared to the rest of the weapons after balance and tweaks. I did say, and I'll repeat, like in a maxed out run where fire rate is maxed out and it doesn't matter, and number of projectiles is maxed out, it doesn't matter. Base damage is what everything scales from, so who has the highest base damage? Sniper, because it's 100. But you're only shooting 0.8 per second, which brings it down to a medium damage per second. Very high proc rate, but super slow fire rate. So just like the rocket, you have to find fire rate. And again, you kind of have to find something like split or arc or triple, maybe targeting shot, maybe scatter shot. You know, the list goes on, and you're going to find one eventually. But the fact that you have to get your fire rate up, and you have to get additional projectiles, makes it very tough. Sniper was one of the hardest for me to get the diamond win on, especially doing it solo. There's a reason. It's just a slow start. It's very situational. But we did get the first person scope recently, and that has ultimately made my decision to put it in B tier as opposed to leaving it down in C tier. It's a good weapon still, but it's more situational again. So just a reminder that we are thinking about these from the terms of like, what is gonna have good variety, and I just don't see the Sniper having a ton of variety. So if I do my final ranking in order of how I've got it on the sheet here, first is Crossbow, second auto shotty, third Orb, fourth is Marksman, oh baby, it's up here now, fifth is Seagle, sixth is Blade, 7 dual shotties, 8 laser cannons, 9 cluster, 10 AR, 11 Sniper. Okay, so I did put it up a little bit higher. 12 Minigun, 13 Arcane Wand, 14 Burst, 15 Flamethrower, 16... Honestly, these are tied for dead last. I got dual pistols last on this sheet, but it doesn't really matter. They're both just so mid right now. And again, I'll continue to repeat myself. It doesn't mean the weapons are awful. It doesn't mean you can't have a good run with them. But it does mean they're situational. You kind of get forced into certain builds where if you don't get those, you're really struggling. I think it's a little bit unfair with the dual pistols. Like, you can definitely run a lot of things with dual pistols. But the question then becomes, would I pick the dual pistols instead of AR? Would I pick the dual pistols instead of the burst pistol? Would I pick the dual pistols instead of cluster? And I can never, ever say yes. So even though on paper, like dual pistols, there's nothing necessarily wrong with them. They're not bad, but they're not fun to play with due to the lack of aim down sight, and they don't bring anything to the table that makes me pick them over other options. They're just super meh. And the rocket, sometimes there is the incentive, right? Sometimes there's the incentive to like, hey, I just want to make like a crazy cluster bomb, like carpet bomb weapon. or like the bowling build we did. Me and Flappy have done that twice now. Go check those out. You get big shot, bouncing shot, and heavy shot on a rocket. It's so goofy, but so fun. You can't do that with other weapons, right? So anyway, looking at this list, we've got a nice distribution here, a little bit of a bell curve going on. I think it's pretty fair. Yeah, I think I'm yapping at this point. I think this is pretty solid. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section. Let's argue. Let's just have a nice, aggressive, disrespectful argument in the comment section. I want to revisit weapon mods, perks, ability / grenade mods. I'm not going to do tier lists for all of those because there's just too many and it just takes years. But, you know, top 10s, top 5s, whatever kind of list, I will be doing those. And be on the lookout. I will also be doing a, like, year in review, you know, full year of early access. Like, what are the, you know, largest changes for Crab Champions over that year. So that'll be coming up soon. Hopefully you liked the video. If you did like it, subscribe to the channel. I'm the Crab Champions Mans. Have a good one. See ya.